Yes, it's 8 o'clock Central Europe time. We can start. Huh? Good evening for the people from Europe. Good morning for those coming from the east of me in Australia and in Asia. And good afternoon for those people from the west of me in America. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the whole Executive Committee of ISPS for the third international webinar since the start of the pandemic. As you already knew, this webinar is recorded. But before we start, I want to introduce you Antonia Svensson. Antonia, can you put your camera on? Yes, hello, Antonia. She's our ISPS international organizer living in Greece, and she's the host of this webinar, together with Mariana Karjalainen. Mariana, hello, Mariana, member of the EC living in Finland, and she will be the co-host. They will answer your practical questions that you can ask via the chat. In my very short introduction, I want to propose you one single thought. I highly recommend you all to read the book Beloved of the Black female writer Toni Morrison. It's a book about love, but also a book about the possible consequences of racism and psychosis. Toni Morrison tells us in her unique style, and I quote a little bit adapted, white people planted their own jungle behind the dark skin of colored people because they are scared for their own jungle within themselves. End of the quote. We are all racist. But when we are able to cope with our anxiety for the jungle inside ourselves, I believe this can help to fight against racism. Toni Morrison also learned us, and I quote again, the function of freedom is to free someone else. This is the reason why ISPS organized this webinar with this topic. And we found it important to hear three voices from different races and different continents. We invited Ingo Lambrecht as a moderator for this webinar because we know him as a very open person with multiple qualities to lead the discussion. When we invited him, his first comment was, it is not a good option because I'm a white male human being. Why don't you ask it to a person from another race? But we decided to take the risk. Ingo Lambrecht is a German, having trained and practiced as a clinical psychologist in South Africa, qualified as a Sangoma, a South African shaman, and for the last nearly 20 years, he has been living and working in New Zealand as a psychologist and a psychotherapist. So he knows very well what it means to be a migrant and had intense contact with very different races and cultures. For us, he was the excellent man to take up this role as a moderator. During this webinar, we can't see you at the other side of the screen, and we are very curious to know who you are. Therefore, we propose you two polls. Antonia, can you give us the first poll? Yes. I read it for you. Do you mainly identify as, there are multiple choices, a mental health professional, a family member or carer of someone with psychosis, someone with lived experience of psychosis, or someone else of another? And then also the second poll, which part of the world are you joining us from today? From Europe, from North America, from South America, from Africa, or from Asia? And I don't see from Australia.
It's there, it's further down.
Oh, it's further down, okay. Yeah.
It looks like most people have voted now, so
Yeah.
I'll end the polling in just a few seconds.
Okay.
And we can see the results.
Most of the people are mental health professionals, yeah. Family members also, some people also with lived experiences. Most people come from Europe, some from North America, South America, Africa, no one, Asia, Australia, yes, Antarctica, no one. Okay. Thank you very much, but it's wonderful that we can have contact with all over the world. But I think I've spoken enough now. And with pleasure, I give the word to our moderator, Ingo, who will explain you more about the structure of the webinar and how the panel conversation and the discussion with the audience will be organized. Ingo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludi, for your very thoughtful introduction and your kind words. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And wherever you are in the world. And if you are here with us now or in the future, as this will be recorded, welcome to this ISPS webinar on racism and psychosis. As you heard, my name is Ingo Lambrecht, your moderator, and I will be seeking to unpack this topic with three panelists, namely Harry Sewell, Pikihuia Omare, and Michael O'Loughlin. And we shall just tell you a bit about how we're going to spend this time together. So we're just going to briefly allow the panelists to introduce themselves and where they are in the world. Then every one of them will speak for about 5 minutes to tell us a bit about their perspective on racism and psychosis. After that, we will have an exploration and a conversation part, which will take us around 20 minutes. And if you wish, think of us as a jazz quartet, where every instrument brings its own quality, its own timbre, its own voice to this topic. We'll improvise, we'll riff off each other, ask questions, and allow the flow to take us where it will. So it's less about absolutes and certainties, more about curiosity and experimentation, and maybe exploring a bit of the edge, what is known and what isn't known. And in case we get stuck or we get a bit dull, I'm hoping that, Harry, you'll bring out your saxophone and just jive us up a bit, if you would be so kind. But I hope it doesn't come quite to that. Then, dear audience, it is your turn. For about 30 minutes, we'd love to hear what your thoughts are, what you consider, what instrument you play in this question around racism and psychosis. And you have three very experienced, knowledgeable panelists to ask any questions. And we will again riff off that and unpack that more. The last 10 minutes will create the closing time, final words, and then the 90-minute webinar will be completed. And I believe Ludi will then come in again. Right, so without further ado, I would like to hand over to Harry, just to briefly let us know who you are and where you are.
Hello, I'm Harry Sewell. I'm based in the UK, in the north of England, in Bradford, and my roots go back to Jamaica. I was born in England, spent 10 years in Jamaica, and that's very central to who I am, largely because upon my return to England as a 15-year-old, I realized that my experience of living in a country with a predominantly Black population who had people in all walks of life including the so-called top jobs, I had no limitations on my aspirations, and I was struck by an alternative experience of my peers who were brought up in a society where their ambitions and their view of their possibilities had been suppressed. So that's enough about me. I currently am a writer and academic looking into subjects of race and mental health, amongst other things.
Thank you. Kia ora. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Tēnei te mihi o te ngākau kia koutou, te mihi o Matariki kia koutou katoa. So kia ora from Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're in the middle of winter here, and it's currently 10 minutes past 6 o'clock, and I'm just wishing and extending wishes for Matariki, which is the Māori New Year, when we celebrate the rising of the Matariki stars, the Pleiades. I am a Māori clinical psychologist. I come from Hokianga in the north of New Zealand, and Tauranga Moana, which is in the Bay of Plenty. I was raised within a Māori language home and schooling environment, which I feel very blessed for, and also born in the Hokianga. I'm currently working at Massey University in New Zealand as a lecturer and a postdoctoral fellow. And I've always had an interest in this area of understanding mental health from an Indigenous perspective, particularly psychosis, and looking at solutions from that perspective as well. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you so much, Vicky. Michael.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael O'Loughlin. I reside in Long Island, east of New York City. I was born in Ireland and grew up in Ireland until I was a young adult and came to New York for graduate school. I was raised in a colonized society, which the south of Ireland is free, but was significantly influenced by colonizing influences for over 1,000 years. And I became very interested in the experience of colonization and transgenerational trauma resulting from that. So I was also raised in a profoundly conservative Catholic society, which laid its mark on me as well, I have to say. But then I came to the United States and I became white. And that was a whole new experience for me of experiencing my racial identity as being somebody who shifted from feeling oppressed to being of the oppressor class. And Frederick Douglass visited Ireland in 1827, and he said he was astounded that people who were so oppressed could step onto American soil in the 1800s and instantly hate and despise the Negro. And I've been wrestling with that conundrum ever since. I teach at Adelphi University, which has a PhD in clinical psychology and a psychoanalytic training program. And two of the courses I teach in the doctoral program, one is called Trauma, and it focuses on intergenerational trauma, and the other one is called Madness and Psychosis. And I'm particularly interested in the psychosocial origins of human distress. I'm very glad to be here. It's a privilege to join this group today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all of you. And now, dear audience, you have met our participants, and maybe we can turn to you, Harry, and begin to kind of help us understand what your focus is in terms of racism and psychosis. What makes you curious in this field?
Primarily, my understanding of psychosis is that whilst people are having to split off from themselves, and that pattern becomes enmeshed in their everyday life, it is one step closer to a complete fragmentation, because there is this repetitive process creating neural pathways that are accustomed to having one step outside of oneself. So that's my entry point into this. And then I think, well, why might it be that people of color are living in a society, in a world where they feel the need to constantly step outside of themselves. And our examination of the experience of people of color is that they constantly get messages about where they fit in a racialized hierarchy, which means that they are living with a sense of self, which they might wish to reject. So most of us in this field will understand that if you continually try and reject a part of yourself, then that doesn't bode well for a cogent mental health and mental wellness. So that's it. That's my kind of central lens through which I examine the world. The step on from that for me is the fact that those features of the experience of people of color, which creates that sense of being at the bottom of the hierarchy, is often invisible to people who don't experience it. And a lot of what I'm talking about now is the fact that when clinicians, for example, conceptualize an experience of racism, they are curious about the obvious and offensive forms of racism, which they can name, an individual can describe, and they can document as perhaps causal or contributory. The diffuse forms of racism that people experience are often invisible to the clinician and are often not taken into account. They're often invisible to the people who experience them, but the impact is not invisible. For example, living in a society where your educational system might not include any knowledge of people who look like you, might not be obvious as part of your experience because it's become normalized, but at some level, that will act as a reminder about where you fit in the racialized hierarchy if your view is no one who looks like you is a contributor to the knowledge that helps the world to progress. That diffuse and invisible form of racism happens in multiple ways. And going back to Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks of 1967, he pretty much outlined what people currently refer to as code switching. This reality where people are being at least two people, but are being multiple people in order to find a place in society that they feel can't welcome the real them. So finally, for me, the challenge is how can we enable clinicians to A, be aware of the diffuse manifestations of racism that, as I say, even the person with whom they're working might not even be able to name and give a language to, but it will still have an impact. So how can they first be aware of that? And then secondly, find a way to include that in their formulation with the person with whom they're in contact, because that will then shift the focus away from looking for major cataclysmic events in people's lives to try and understand it, but to understand just living in this society is going to be toxic for them. And a failure to take account of that becomes toxic because, in effect, it's a denial of people's experiences. So that's my area of interest.
Thank you, Harry. That's thought-provoking. Pikuia, what are your ways of approaching this topic?
Kia ora, Harry, and I really like that those thoughts that you've laid out for us, because I think it links into some of the ideas that I've been thinking about on this topic as well. So just to give you a framework for Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have had the experience of colonisation here in Aotearoa, and that's had a really significant impact on well-being, mental health generally, and all sorts of different areas. And to look at racism in Aotearoa, it's quite a topical issue at this present time. part of it is because one of our main political parties is not doing so well in the polls. So in order for them to gain more support, they've been promoting a lot of this rhetoric, which has then allowed a lot of overt racism to occur. So this issue for me and for many Māori is in our faces at the moment. There've been campaigns in Aotearoa in New Zealand for some time. We've known about this issue. As Māori, we experience it, it's a lived experience. We've had campaigns such as Give Nothing to Racism, that was launched by the Human Rights Commission, and famous people like Taika Waititi talking about New Zealand being racist as fuck, he called it, he said. So, you know, and there was a lot of reactivity to that comment. But what I've noticed as a clinical psychologist is that yes, you have the overt racism, you have people who are saying things about Māori women with who wear the markings on their face, really disparaging remarks, calling Māori the scourge of society, saying, you know, all these, you know, that colonisation was good for Māori. And so when we have these constant negative messages about ourselves, there is an impact on us, which I think was what Harry was talking about. And so what does that look like in mental health services? Well, Māori are seen as a risk to be managed. We're seen as violent, and it impacts us in different ways. So, you know, how we're treated by clinicians, how the models that are used to understand these experiences have been imported from the West, which often leads to things like misdiagnosis, pathologizing experiences that we could understand as being spiritual experiences. And it really limits and reduces the types of recovery options, treatments or interventions that are available to people. And from my experience working as a psychologist for 8 years, I noticed that really there was a lot of dehumanizing that was happening to our people in the system. And the people who needed these access to these Indigenous knowledge systems, the ones that needed it the most weren't able to access it. So these are some of the ideas that I'm thinking about. And just the idea around, you know, colonisation as being something that is the whole process, which is ongoing, is something that is stripped away mana, which can be described as power, integrity, authority from a whole group of people. And so thinking about that idea, how do we then look at how our practices can address that issue?
Kia ora, Kihui. I so appreciate and can relate to what you've said and witness that, most definitely. Michael, tell us a bit about your approach to this topic. Michael, I'm not sure I'm hearing you.
That's the old mute button. I apologize.
Great.
I wanted to begin with sharing a thought from Morgan Medlock from a study in 2016, where he said, the field of psychiatry developed at the time of colonialism and slavery, when myths of racism were being integrated into European culture. In America, they continue, during the civil rights movement, African Americans angry about their oppression were labeled, quote, schizophrenic due to their supposed pathological reaction of emotional disharmony, hostility, and aggression. In the New York Times in April 2021, Judith Warner wrote an article about the American Psychiatric Association. She noted, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the 18th century doctor who is often called the father of American psychiatry, held the racist belief that black skin was the result of a mild form of leprosy. He called the condition negritude. His apprentice, Samuel Cartwright, invented the term drapetomania to describe the illness of the disease causing Negroes to run away. The American Psychiatric Association had Benjamin Rush's image on their logo until 2015. So one of my concerns really, and I haven't written about this directly in relation to psychiatry, but I have in relation to psychoanalysis, is the problem that the field is founded in colonial thought. And so the inherent foundational assumptions of the field are deeply embedded in a residue of colonizing assumptions that leads to an unexamined whiteness at the very center of our work. That for me as a white person, I'm personally implicated in and resistant to whiteness points towards the indispensable role of critical autobiographical work. I was at a meeting of our Psychoanalytic Society last night, and they have planned a whole series of talks on racism. And they asked for feedback, and I said I thought it was a mistake. We should be working on ourselves, not bringing in outsiders to speak to us and making us feel like we've solved the problem. I think that a lot of the work that's being done, such as mandatory diversity seminars and courses in diversity awareness, have very limited impact because they don't allow us to scratch the surface and look at the deep melancholic residue that people carry within themselves from colonization. So my work is really in two parts. One part is unpacking whiteness. I recently wrote a paper for contemporary psychoanalysis on whiteness and the psychoanalytic imagination. Another part is looking at the decolonizing necessary to understand how our history has shaped us. And I have a paper coming out soon on cultural ruptures, which uses my own Irish experience to talk about how our history constructs who we are. That applies to the Maori people in New Zealand, it applies to people in Jamaica, and it applies to people who were taken across the Atlantic Ocean during the slavery period to the United States. It applies in all contexts how the diasporas of the world have been created through massive traumas and through massive decolonizing of people's minds. Celia Brickman wrote a book called where she analyzes the language of mental health, and she talks about how words like primitive and regression that we use unquestioningly every day are inherently rooted in colonizing assumptions. And how do we unconceal the language of our work? How do we unconceal the language of diagnosis? And more important still, I think, is what I would call an absence of narrative, genealogy, intergenerational trauma, spectrality, context, culture, or even story in psychiatric diagnosis. And the psychohistorical tools for understanding the kinds of injuries inflicted by cultural traumas, I'm convinced that much of what we see is this, and you only have to look at the United States, at the overdiagnosis of African Americans and the over-hospitalization of African Americans to draw a conclusion about this. I just wanted to offer one more thought. In the US, there appears to be an accelerating shift away from understanding the etiology of psychosis towards management of symptoms. And this is, I think, more advanced or more regressed, depending on how you look at it in the US than elsewhere in the world. Often deploying pharmacology as the primary means of treatment. Nicholas Rose talks about the replacement of human interiority with what he calls neurochemical salves. And Joan Beale, discussing the treatment of sufferers in Brazil, speaks of the pharmaceuticalization of distress. Why do we see distress as a medical problem rather than a psychosocial or psychohistorical or ancestral problem? Many people argue that a shift is required in healthcare, that there is a shift in healthcare away from narrative and towards managerial neoliberal approaches to mental health care built on econometric and reductionist notions of care that have led to an erosion of the significance of narrative, genealogy, and individual and collective unconscious knowing as means of understanding psychiatric suffering. And I'll just end by just citing two brief examples. One is Stefania Pandolfo's excellent work in North Africa, where she has studied in Morocco and looked at the complexity of a young man coming in and sitting in an emergency room and being diagnosed with a westernized form of psychiatry. His mother is sitting there the entire time, understanding the social production of this man's distress, but has no voice because his treatment is being following a westernized model. And if you're familiar with Devon and Gouthier's work on history beyond trauma, for instance, they argue for an artfully attuned listening that recognizes the historical and ancestral communication that is potentially embedded in psychosis. Sometimes they're right. A fit of madness tells us more than all the news dispatches about the leftover facts that have no right to existence. This describes psychosis as the destruction of autobiographic consciousness. Lacking another with the capability to respond truthfully to the knots of their souls, persons experiencing psychosis are destined to experience an interiority invaded by annihilation, anxiety, and stress. And I wonder why we devote so much time to categorizing and treating rather than seeking to understand inclusively what people's experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That really triggered a lot of thoughts in me, and maybe we can come together now in terms of a conversation and begin to explore something that I noticed, Harry, you talked about the diffuse factors that are of racism that we need to acknowledge. And you mentioned the colonizing and the dehumanizing process that is happening right now. And I like, Michael, what you say about the history of psychiatry being deeply embedded and rooted in racism. So a question that arises in me, if this is the case, what does that mean for our understanding of psychosis or madness? Because you all are actually hinting at something that we cannot take that for granted. And I'd just be curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think
who'd like to begin?
I think I'd like to join in Michael's kind of perspective that actually embedded in the whole architecture of psychiatry is a kind of colonizing mentality. And one of the problems we have is that because this is now the orthodoxy, everything else is seen as an alternative. And that's the problem we have. Because we're now trying to unpick what is already established. And in fact, it almost seems as though we need to prove that the orthodoxy is no longer valid, as opposed to saying, well, it was never valid. And actually, what happened was that other perspectives, indigenous perspectives, for example, were sidelined. So that's where I kind of start, is that, if we were to start with a blank sheet, which obviously we cannot, we would be interested in the narrative, we would be interested in people's experiences. And primarily, when we think of trauma, we would not be just considering trauma as something that happens inside people's heads or in an emotional space, but we'd understand the collective nature of trauma, and we'd also understand that it's embodied. So we experience it in our bodies, in our cognition, and in our feelings and our emotions. And that's where I think we need to go. Once we understand more about how trauma manifests itself, I think we'd then have to shift what we do in psychiatry, because we wouldn't try and treat this mythical illness in someone's head. We'd have to recognize all those multiple parts.
If I could just add on, I totally agree with what Harry's saying. If I could just push the thought a little further, I would argue that modern neoliberal forms of government, which are spreading rapidly across the world, are a new form of colonialism, which is a vested interest in maintaining the same white supremacist underpinning that was there from the beginning. It just takes a new form now, and it's been turned into a commodity in the form of medication and commodified health services. But I think it's another version of the same thing. I'm not sure it's changed that much. If you go back to the 1700s and 1800s, to the foundations of neoliberal thought, you'll see that strand has underpinned the expansion of the entitlement of colonialism, and I think it still does. So that's why it's, I think, so difficult to change, because it's baked into the capitalist system that we all work within.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who's attempted to, as a clinical psychologist who's attempted to speak to some of these issues, you're really putting yourself at risk a lot of times, because it's that issue of power. And, you know, as a Māori Indigenous woman, who, yeah, there's multiple layers to that as well. So, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that impact that it does have of you know, speaking out about these things. And to bring it back to a New Zealand example again, some of the women who have been speaking out about this issue of racism in New Zealand have been targeted, yeah, quite severely actually, and so that, yeah, just merely raising this issue can be, yeah, cause distress.
Yeah, difficult.
And it also seems as if the, to take something what you talked about, Michael, is that exactly the diffuse the racism of the neoliberal approach that then limits our way of thinking about distress in a certain way. And you, Harry, talk about that in a way that wonders what we could do with that and how people are struggling with this in everyday life and switching codes, as you mentioned, how we have different parts of us. And I suppose I'd be curious from your own experiences or working with people, how have you seen that emerge?
I think
anyone.
Yeah, for a lot of Māori families who come into services or service users, people are really reluctant to share how they experience and understand and make meaning of these experiences or yeah, just to describe what they're experiencing because of the model that might be applied to them. So I think there's a lot of silencing that happens. And even from a practitioner perspective, I think a lot of the time there's that hesitation there around being able to present a perspective that might be more aligned with the culture of the person who's in the service, because of those layers of power, once again.
I was under the impression that in New Zealand at Taroa that there was an option for people to pursue Indigenous treatment or Westernized treatment. Is that viable still?
Yes. However, it's still within the system of under the Western system, which is very much run by psychiatry. Yeah.
Interesting.
So we still have the hierarchy and the hegemony in New Zealand, even now in our Māori mental health services.
And I'm really interested in how we pivot between trying to understand what happens in a clinical context and the restructuring of society, our global society, and the kind of once we start to kind of think about governments and capitalism, and then you're kind of talking about big structural change. And for me, I guess it reflects what I am challenged with. So I do a lot of work with professionals in the field trying to kind of get to this, and they want to know what they can do in practice, and I try and offer some insights and some support, thinking about toxic interactions, which I kind of mentioned before, as some kind of insight into kind of understanding how by being silent on that diffuse racism, practice becomes toxic, and I kind of try and shine light on that. But of course, what I'm really interested in is how we can restructure society, our global society, so that the violences that are inflicted on people of color, we can reduce those and eventually get to a point where we can eradicate them. So yeah, I was just kind of noticing in our conversation, we're reenacting the challenge that I think we're faced with every day. Tyson Yunkaporta, is that the correct pronunciation? In Sand Talk, describes really eloquently how what we do is to passport our violence to multinationals and to governments, that we're all complicit in the kind of violence within the system. but we don't have to see it. You know, we get our shiny mobile phones and we're kind of happy with that. And we don't have to really come into contact with the, you know, way in which that impacts on indigenous populations elsewhere. You know, that's just one example of many. So I'm kind of really interested in that.
You know, Ethan Waters wrote a book a few years back called The Globalization of the American Psyche, which is precisely about exporting this colonial notion of mental illness, if you want to use such a term, and planting it in indigenous people all over the world. It's just astounding. That's the globalization movement is part of neoliberalism, of course. I gave a talk a few years back, and a colleague who was desperate for a speaker called me and says, "Can you come and speak at our hospital in Ohio?" And I flew out to Ohio and I spoke to a large grand rounds. And then afterwards, they asked me to meet with the medical residents, which was about 30 young people who were doctors, psychiatric residents, for 2 hours. So we sat in a room together. And the first thing they asked me was, why was I so critical of psychiatry? And why was I critical of medications? And so I tried to explain it in a non-defensive way. And they were very polite. And after about an hour of our discussion, one of the young people said to me, "We'd really like to thank you for coming." And they all got up and just walked out. They were carrying caseloads of 300 and 400 patients each. And they were literally processing them through a hospital, dishing out medications to them, seeing them for 15 minutes, and they were done. They couldn't possibly incorporate my worldview into how they were trained and into the neoliberal system in which they work. My daughter is now a physician, and she doesn't work in psychiatry, but she works in a situation of near impossibility. The system has turned, you know, we read in the 30s with the Tavistock Clinic studies of time and motion studies of labor, how they could, you know, like Amazon warehouses, everything was timed to this. They're doing this to physicians too. I mean, you only have to look at the National Health Service and the way they've segmented down time, even for family doctors, never mind psychiatrists. So we're really the difficulties of change, structural change, are very difficult because the minimal training that our psychologists get extensive training for what it's worth, but our psychiatrists in the US get probably 2 courses in abnormal psychology, that's what it's called. And then they learn everything else as an apprentice to other people doing exactly this work. So it's really, really hard to figure out how to engage them in a conversation. And if they're predominantly white, because the representation of people of color in medicine in the US is exceedingly low. It's for African Americans, it's probably 2-3% at best. How do you find a way to have those conversations when everybody's either fatigued from it, feels guilty from it, or goes out into a system that says, you know, you can have these ideas, but there's no room for it. I don't have the answer to those questions.
I think you raise a good point. Sorry, pick you again.
Oh no, I was going to say, some of the things that I encounter when I'm doing this sort of training too is a lot of resistance and opposition and unwillingness to change from the status quo. And yes, I can understand that, you know, people are under stress and strain, and thinking about the models that we, even in psychology, are teaching have been imported from the West, and really they represent only 12% of the world's population. The rest of the world has actually, you know, if we're going to turn it on its head, maybe that's actually anomalous rather than, you know, the holistic kind of collective cultures who have a lot of other different ways of making meaning and interpreting and conceptualizing these issues. But yeah, and we're still stuck with the current system and the way it is at the moment.
I'm particularly interested in, like for tonight, for this session, how we make the connection with psychosis, because I think many people with whom I will have conversations, I can see they understand, you know, depression or anxiety, and kind of other forms of presentation, but that kind of fragmentation that is represented in what people might refer to as psychosis, you know, I think the dominant discourse is so embedded in our collective psyche that it's hard for many to think of it other than largely biologically determined, and definitely a kind of illness. And yeah, so I'm really interested in the PQ and Mike's perspective on how we make sense of, the relationship between what we're talking about, the kind of traumas and psychosis.
Yeah, I think that's, Harry, I agree. That's really a key issue, is for us as professionals to articulate those connections. I've been reading Pierre Olagne's book, The Violence of Interpretation, for instance. She was a French psychoanalyst who wrote about two things really. First of all is the family language, and how the family language can either include a child so they experience themselves as a human being, or can cause them to not experience themselves and experience a dislocation from their own being, which can yield a psychosis. So a person can feel a sense of blankness where they should feel recognition, for instance. But her work can also be applied, and certainly Karima Lazali's book on colonial trauma, which just came out, is an attempt to do this. I'm reading her book now. Is an attempt to say that also applies at the cultural level. That if a society creates a way of negating one's sense of one's own goodness and one's own recognition of one's own being, simply because you cannot be seen in school, for instance, or in society, because there's a failure of recognition, as one would see, for instance, with Indigenous Australians or Indigenous North Americans, where their invisibility is a factor, or where they're seen as a violent other, as African Americans can be in the US at times as well. Then the child's capacity to receive and experience their own being is really damaged. And I would argue certainly we could make a case for situations like that, or for cases for events from the past that are transmitted, that you see long-term impact on the subjectivity of subsequent generations. We've seen this with Holocaust research. We've seen it with some research from slavery, that you can see traces coming down. And I'm working on some work on the Irish famine from the 1800s, showing how characteristics of the Irish population to this day, including a strong tendency to alcoholism, strong tendency to depression, more incidences of disorder. My own family has had incidents of psychosis and paranoid psychosis, lengthy amounts of alcoholism, chronic depression, and so on, that these things undoubtedly could be traced back, even epigenetically, to an event many hundreds of years back. I think we can do that work, and I think it's really helpful if we do, because just preaching against the neoliberal push in the other direction to make it a disease and to make it a chemical imbalance, which feeds the entire pharmaceutical industry, we're not going to succeed doing that. As the old saying goes, that's like pissing in the wind. But if we find a way to actually maybe articulate this other argument, we can convince at least some medical professionals in the field to understand another way of thinking. And that's what my attempt is to try and do. And I suspect that's what you're doing in your own way as well, both clinically and theoretically, by trying to understand what is the impact on human subjectivity of injury, deep injury that comes from cultural trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I did make one note, I don't want to say any more, but I just listed 4 things. This gets back to Ingo's question earlier. 4 things that I thought are remarkably missing, except perhaps in open dialogue in Finland or something, that are missing in our capacity to receive a person with what I call psychic distress of any kind. One is an absence of interest in spirituality and ancestry, an absence of interest in family, the holding capacity of family, an absence of interest in culture, and an absence of interest in how we can create a holding space that keeps those pieces in the room, so the person is seen as a fully human subject and not seen as a, well, for want of a better word, a crazy person or a disturbed person or a psychotic person or any of those depersonalizing words.
Because I'd like that it's about our history, but what you mentioned just now, maybe even the epistemology, the thought structure, the spirituality. Not every voice I hear may be a problem. Not every voice is madness. It might be my ancestors, and it can be distressing. And how do I work with that? And maybe Pikuya can speak more of that. But so that other cultures and other ways of being have maybe different ways of understanding this and solving this. And so thank you very much for bringing that up. But maybe we have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is an area that I've been interested in for a long time, around spirituality and what we would consider, and what we would have considered in traditional times to be giftedness or matakite or matekite. And on the other side is the experience of distress when people are feeling really unwell, and what that's called is often mate Māori. And so what we would have had in traditional times is a whole way of working with people to help, where, you know, from early childhood, you're learning the spiritual aspect of your being, and learning how to discern different messages that you might be receiving from Wairua or from within the spiritual realm. And many Māori still hold those beliefs today. And so part of some of the research that I've been involved in more recently, alongside some of my colleagues at Massey, we looked at how Māori and non-Māori interpreted what are considered anomalous experiences or exceptional experiences. And we found that there was a difference between how people of the general public, but also clinicians, interpreted these experiences. And I think, so what it showed is that Māori, obviously, a lot of these spiritual experiences were normal and legitimate everyday things that we have, you know, we see our ancestors as a positive influence on us, and they're a part of our everyday life. But for me, I'm wondering about people who, as I mentioned before, they're people who have the most difficulty, in my experience, are the ones who haven't had that access because of colonisation to this knowledge and to ways of understanding how to discern messages and how to ground themselves when they're feeling really distressed. Yeah, so yeah, one part of what I've been thinking about is how do we explore that with people in a way that is allowing them to share their experience, not to pathologize it, but to normalize that experience, but also to acknowledge that, as you mentioned, Michael, there's a fear around exploring that. There's it's not considered as valid or legitimate knowledge. So how do we, what does that look like in practice, and how are we enabling that exploration of that, and enabling people to access those forms of healing, which then, if people have an explanatory model that enables them to make meaning of their experiences, we know that that can lessen their experience of distress. So yeah, that's part of what I've been thinking about. How are we meaningfully allowing Wairua spirituality to be a part of how we understand these experiences, but also a source of strength for people.
I think one of the tragic consequences, one of the successes, if you like, the terrible successes of colonization, was its capacity to sever people from their cultures and their languages. You only have to look at the residential school movement in the US, Canada, and Australia, for instance. I don't think they had that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but certainly was big in Australia and US and Canada, where there was an intentionality to severance. And in Ireland, they banned the Irish language and they banned Catholicism. So they secretly educated children in hedge schools to try and preserve some elements of culture. But in fact, less than 2 or 3% of Irish people speak their indigenous language anymore, and the cultural practices associated with it are gone. So it's a really interesting question. How do you recuperate memory for people who have lost it maybe 3 centuries ago? And I think that's what Devon and Godier's book is about, is how do you recreate social linkages when those linkages are only embodied in our bodies at this point. They're inscribed on us, but they're not active in our cognitions anymore. It's really a great puzzle. But I think that if psychosis is a communication, our job is to try and cultivate a receptivity to the communication. And clearly, the more prepared we are to culturally receive, the better. So if you were in a room with a patient and Harry was in a room and Ingo was in a room and I was in a room, we'd all have the patient would have a very different experience of being with each one of us. And finding somebody who could be a culturally receptive person to engage with that patient would clearly matter, I would imagine, in a very significant way. I mean, any of us could potentially be trained, but clearly if we had the background, we'd have a better chance. And Harry would have a better chance with some patients than I would, and Ingo would have a better chance with some patients than I would, and so would you, I'm sure.
I wish we could just... I so agree, Michael. And what we might need to do now is to bring in the audience, because it is time for you, dear audience, to join us in this exploration. And hello. And I wonder,
I think Ingo is having some problems with connection, obviously, but there are some questions from the audience. I think that was the way he was going with this.
Yes, please.
Good. Okay, but we got a question from Martin da Silva. And he quite early, and he really liked the phrase about the field of psychiatry having developed at a time of slavery and colonialism, Michael, and he would like you to share the link or the name of the author again. Maybe you can do that in the chat. But he also has another question. And he says, I totally agree with Harry. I was thinking as to ways in which we can extrapolate these philosophical, political, economic, historic reflections into the therapy rooms, and also how can we transfer the hopefully safe space beyond our clinic walls? How can we validate and at the same time foster societal change? Big questions.
If I could respond to that, because this is precisely what I write about. So, there's a particular model, toxic interaction theory, which really outlines, as I said earlier on, how we end up in toxic relationships with people without even realizing it by non-validating their experiences. And the starting point is to recognize that rather than conceptualizing our encounters as occurring, let's just say in that room at that time, that actually we're interacting with people's histories. Those histories will be the recent histories in someone's personal life, but also in terms of the kind of long-term histories and kind of intergenerational histories. And if we begin to acknowledge that all of that will exist in the room, then we'd have to incorporate that into our formulations. And that's the starting point. And over time, I think clinicians collectively will begin to tell a story of a pattern. I often kind of make the point that we know in adult mental health services in the UK that at least 50%, but probably 85% of women in our psychiatric wards are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. That's well known. But there is insufficient collective response to that because there's insufficient account being taken of that in the space. And therefore, collectively, there's not an action to say, as a society, we need to restructure what we're doing. And that kind of trauma exists in race terms, that until clinicians can begin to recognize amongst themselves that, well, we're not just interacting with what's in the room, there's the personal and the family histories, then that's where the shift or the possibility of shifts occurs. And there are lots of frameworks that support that kind of way of working. So yeah, look out for my document, Toxic Interaction Theory, that captures some of that.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience, or do the other panelists wish to address this question?
No, I just wanted to respond to the request for reference. I don't have them immediately to hand, but I'd be glad to put my email in the chat and compile them later and send them. I have a number of pieces that directly address the history question in the US that might be of interest. So I'll just put my email in the chat. People can write if they're interested.
Great.
Okay, there are more questions there. There's one from Doug. He wonders, what do panelists think about how the embedded process of trauma and racism is going on? Is it about introducing shame as an effect into the individual?
I would say shame is a component, of course, but I would say it's deeper than that. Yeah, I would say it's. I mean, I just writing a paper with a colleague now on racial subjectivity and how we develop a sense of our inner being, and I think shame is certainly a mechanism for accomplishing that. And if you look at Frantz Fanon's work that Harry mentioned earlier, he mentions epidermalization and inferiorization as things. Epidermalization is inferiority because of your very perception of your skin, and then the inferiorization becoming intrinsic. Frantz Fanon walks down the street in Paris and a mother is wheeling her baby down the street and she says, look, a black man, I'm scared. And so it becomes, I think it's much deeper than shame, but shame is certainly a mechanism that begins that process. And me growing up in Ireland, if you looked at a combination of colonialism and Catholicism, shame was a major agent for suppressing our capacity for imagining ourselves as agentic people with thoughts, ideas, and possibilities. So I would say shame is a factor, but I would see it as part of a deeper denial of subjectivity or agency.
It's the gaze of the other that cuts across the distress. And I think what also Pikiwea talks about is it then creates meaning in very specific ways. And how do we unpack that?
Yeah. For Māori, it's the word shame is called whakama, but that's thinking about the experience of trauma as being what we would call mamai, or deep hurt and pain that's felt in a embodied way within our ngākau, which is in our internal system. And I definitely feel that that's part of the work that we need to do, is looking at how we move from whakama or shame into whakamana, or a way of uplifting someone's mana, uplifting their sense of themselves, and their because of the process of colonization has meant that there's been that self-devaluation of the identity. And so anything that we can do to reinstate our identity, our language, which we consider medicine, reo is rongoa, our tikanga, our mātauranga, our protocols and processes, and our knowledge, all of these things have intrinsic holistic value, and they work at the spiritual level to address a lot of that and heal a lot of that that pain and trauma, which is why I think having access to those things is so important. Intrinsically within our way of interacting, it's always about acknowledgement of a person's personhood and their spirituality and their physical being, and all of those things that come alongside of it. So it offers an opportunity to explore the different avenues to reinstate and reclaim those things.
Let me, if I could, just pose a question to Harry that might get it. I don't know if you would agree with this or not, Harry, but my feeling is that one of the mechanisms modern society uses is to resist interiority by creating a consumer self to replace an interior self. And I think this is one of the ways that we get a sense of being disowned from ourselves. And when we see patients, I mean, even the very word consumer, which is widely used for psychiatric patients, to me, a consumer sounds like someone swallowing a pill, but they're consuming something. But we call them consumers, and there's this image of consumption that's so pervasive in our society. And indeed, if consumption fails you and shopping doesn't work, then if you watch American TV, there's endless ads for antidepressant medications. And if your antidepressant medication fails you, there's another medication you can add on top of that that'll help you get you over the hump. So that I really worry that there's a sort of a dispossession of selfhood, because if we could experience the kind of selfhood that Kihui is talking about, we'd become agentic and we would have ideas and thoughts and ideas about how we'd want to be in the world. And I suspect you'd be sympathetic to that way of thinking, Harry.
I am completely. And one of the challenges we have is we're discussing kind of culture and ethnic groups alongside racialized groups. And of course, there's something unique about a racialized identity, which is externally imposed, which creates a sense of a theoretical belonging to a group of people with whom you might not even share a language or a faith or cultures and practices, but literally by virtue of your skin tone, you're supposedly a member of a group, which then means that the behaviors of some in the group seem to be attached to who you are. So there's this multiplicity of divided selves. And therefore, unsurprisingly, an individual needs to kind of, manufacture a version of themselves, which is separate to the dominant group identity that they can embrace and say, this is who I feel comfortable with. Which is why I keep going back to that notion of, the more we practice splitting ourselves off, then the closer we're going to be getting to psychosis. And of course, the problem is that this process begins in childhood before people are adults and can kind of formulate some of these things. They won't have the worldview, they won't have the years, they won't have the language, they won't have the conceptualizations. So at some level, this process begins. And as we know, with adverse childhood experiences, then you're already setting someone up to kind of have a breakdown later on. So this is our challenge, really. How can we kind of earlier on begin to shift that shame, which you kind of talk about, but the shame isn't coming from the inside out, but rather from the outside in, and for us to then deal with it in that way.
And I also think it goes back a long time. I was working with somebody who, when he began to realize that the land lost 4 generations ago, created a story that is part of his psychosis. He could experience himself very, very differently as somebody who's been colonized, rather than just a mad, crazy brown person and dangerous. And that created what was a certain manner, a certain different sense of self, when the story was unraveled differently in the gaze, and that it was about not so much the shame changed to power for him a bit. I'm not saying it was easy or simple, but I think it's not only, as you say, these toxic relationships now, but how for generations they ripple across us and create even deeper splits.
Ingo, you triggered a personal reaction in me, because that was my experience growing up. I was a very angry young guy growing up, railing against the system. My father was a very poor working class man. He and his wife came from really, he had to barter eggs when he had a farm in order to buy cigarettes. They lived subsistence existences. His parents lived in the shadow of the famine, and his grandparents in utter deprivation. And my brother and I particularly grew up really angry at the differential position my parents were put in society. I remember once my mother telling me that somebody asked my father in conversation if he were one of the O'Loughlin's from such a place, and another person in the conversation said, "Far from it, I can assure you." So we grew up with perpetual humiliation based on social class more than anything else. And it took me years and years, including time and analysis, just to recognize that I could move from shame to rage to power. And I think that's a nice sequence. I think Harry talked about that, and you talked about that as well. It's a nice way to think about understanding the difficulties people experience, rather than just labeling the difficulties they experience, which is just not helpful, or trying to medicate them away. Or in the US, incarcerate them away, because incarceration is now the treatment of choice, because hospitals are beginning to shut down psychiatric departments.
Can I just say really quickly, and I will edit myself, but just to say, as what that links to is our conversation about spirituality, because if we conceptualize taking account of spirituality in the patient or the client, we forget that actually we should be thinking about spirituality in our societies, and to not conceptualize that as like a faith system, but how we can understand our role on this planet, so that that kind of intersubjective relationship includes spirituality, our own, in that dialogue. That's kind of what's important, because when we do hear these fascinating, sometimes frightening experiences from people, we're in a place to then sit with it and to kind of reflect on what that's doing to our sense of ourselves and our sense of the world. When we're more rigid and fixed in, you know, kind of professional academic mindset, then it's less easy to let that in. So the spirituality needs to be a collective thing rather than seen as something relating to the patient or the client.
And of course, in material societies, materialism becomes a substitution for this spiritual possibility.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
Yes,
Cecilia.
questions we should take. Very nice to listen to you. Yeah. So Martin da Silva, he's got a question, and he refers to a point made by Michael earlier, which is, if psychosis is or can be understood as a rupture in communication, how can we recreate it? How can we hear such a voice, especially in minorities, silenced for ages, as Hannah Arendt said?
You know, Daniel Dorman wrote a book called Dante's Cure, and he worked with a woman called Catherine Penny for 8 years. And when he began, she was catatonic. She was curled up in a fetal position, and all she could do was drool, and her spit drooled down onto the floor. And he sat with her. And she said later, in fact, there's a videotape where you can see this, a videotape by Daniel Mackler, where you can see this interview where she says, I understood, I just couldn't communicate. And he sat with her for a long time. And over a period of 8 years, she made a complete recovery and became a psychiatric nurse. And I think the problem we have is, I mean, in the US, individual therapy is gone from hospitals. There's group therapy, but it's mainly occupational therapy where people sit around and look at each other. But there's not much emphasis, not completely gone. If you go to places like Austin Riggs Center, they do have individual therapy. But in many mainstream state psychiatric hospitals, there's no therapy anymore. There's no space for sitting with and bearing witness and joining with somebody and seeing if you can enter their experience. And if you go back to the 50-Minute Hour by Robert Lindner in the 50s, he was regarded as a wild animalist, but he tried to enter the experience of people who were having strange experiences. And I don't think we're willing to do that enough. I like bearing witness with an idea and being present with. I'm sorry, Vicky.
No, I was just going to say, no, I don't think there's space to do that in the way that things are currently structured. And what makes me hopeful is that in New Zealand right now, we're thinking about transforming the way that the health system is working. And so, and thinking about what that would look like if we were to create something different for Indigenous people, people of colour. What are the possibilities? And you know, how could we invite in people who have this expertise in spirituality to know how to manage these, to help people manage and allow the spirit to move, so it's not stuck in. How do we embed these things into our everyday lives so that it's not seen as something that is so far away, that it's something that we are, you know, we're interconnected with the environment, we're interconnected with each other, we're interdependent people. We need all these things for our well-being, and how do we build a system that is based on that, where that's our foundation.
Did you say
One thing I would like
to allow the spirit to move? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yes, that's in the US. That's an old Quaker tradition in meetings that you speak when the spirit moves you to. That's a beautiful idea.
I think another thing I'd like to add to that is when I was in South Africa sitting with shamans, the family would come in with the issue. So the rupture isn't just in the person, but is held by notion that the individual is sick is maybe not the only way to think about it, but that the whānau or the family or the group may be involved in the rupture, but equally in the healing. So if ancestors are not happy with me or with stuff going on in the family. So I just wanted to bring that in as well, that of healing these ruptures. Just thought I might throw that in.
Well, I think I missed part of your, you cut out part way through, but I think what you're talking about is the importance of that collective approach and how we look at families or whānau as having their own knowledge and their own strengths within that system, as well as being, you know, a place where healing is needed. But if we are coming at it from a perspective that at the core, families have so much strength and resilience, and you know, we've endured a lot through colonization and these experiences of racism, and so how are we able to reframe how we work with families and how we because ultimately from, you know, when people are unwell, they're going to go back to their families often. And so how do we incorporate that into the healing and the recovery?
Oh, thank you. Any more questions that we could riff on?
A lot of questions, Wim. Elan Cohen is asking, how does one navigate experiences and subjectivities that split us up from our culture, not due to historical trauma and dispossession directly, but due to aspects of ourselves that are inadmissible in our own cultures of origin? For example, different expressions of sexuality and gender identity, which one's culture or of origin might reject. And he's has added something more. In other words, there are ruptures of the social link within cultural groups and families, as well as between cultural groups. Is there a continuity between these forms of rupture that may produce serious psychic distress? Interesting question. Who would like to start?
Well, I'm reluctant to start. Elan's one of my students, so he's asking a tough question. You know, I go back to what I said at the beginning when I was speaking about Pierre Olenya's work in France, and the idea that these ruptures that he's trying to describe, for instance, a rupture around gender identity, in the case that he mentions, our gender identification, are probably seeded very early. And in fact, Olenya says the script could be written before the child is even placed in the crib. And so I think that what you'd want to look for in cases like that is understanding the deep rupture to the core of the psyche. If a child experiences profound dissonance, you could certainly get this in transracial adoptions and other situations as well, where the child finds no way of correspondence for their being to be acknowledged. I think that's where I'd be inclined to go, is to go back to understanding that kind of origin.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I feel really moved to respond to this, because of course often we'll look at populations that have legacies of cultural homophobia. Doesn't mean that everybody has it in that society, but it's kind of, you know, cultural norm, or, you know, very rigid gender identities.
In Jamaica would be an example, Harry, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I guess that's probably why I feel compelled to respond. And there's a challenge because, you know, of course, Jamaica, let's stick in the specifics. Jamaica's got more churches per head of population than anywhere else in the entire world. So it's a tiny island, comparatively speaking. So you can kind of understand where that comes from, given the legacy of the faith perspective on same-sex relationships. So it's unsurprising that that's a cultural norm. But say in the UK, they might look at Jamaica and think, well, you know, that country really needs to kind of catch up with the times, without any acknowledgement of where that culture emerged from, because that's kind of part of the colonization project. And, you know, that kind of passporting of a Judeo-Christian set of values in its most reductive form to a population.
Right.
And I kind of think that it's really helpful if we can go back to source, really, and just check out where these things come from, and to see the relationships between patriarchy, homophobia, racism, misogyny, because they're all connected. And it kind of goes back to what Michael said about, you go back to capitalism, you start to kind of think about, you know, what white men with power kind of did in creating a hegemony, which is then kind of passported around the globe. And the problem is that to say that sounds provocative, and I'll leave it here. We'll talk about Black communities, we'll talk about, you know, minorities from morning until night. Once you start talking about white middle-class men with power, it sounds as though you're being rude, it's just silenced. And I guess that's the bit, and, you know, again, Michael spoke about the kind of invisibility of whiteness. That's, I think, the entry point, is to understand who shaped these narratives and why.
Thank you. I'm realizing we're coming closer to the 2-hour end. We might, is there one more question we could maybe cover?
Yes, Alice has asked a question. As I've been listening, it sounds like there are 2 large core skills and take-home points that is required in order to enhance clinical practice. A need to better define how to exhibit cultural humility as a clinician who treats psychosis, and 2, remembering to seek to understand, regarding the Harry, well, referring to Harry, and asking not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you, referring to Eleanor Longden, for clients with psychosis. I think that was a good one. Do you agree? Yeah.
Yeah, what do others say?
That was Pat Bracken, the Irish psychiatrist who worked with Eleanor Longden. And indeed, he asked her, what has happened to you? Because he asked her, who are you first? I think she said, I'm a schizophrenic. And he said, I didn't ask you what you are. You know, he wanted to know her story of her experience. I forget the exact wording. Yes. Absolutely.
And in fact, that phrase is now used as a summary of the trauma-informed approach, that, you know, services, you know, kind of are interested in what's happened to you, and which links back to what we've been talking about, is racialized trauma. And what I've kind of been saying more specifically, that the racialized trauma doesn't just manifest in these big cataclysmic events, but this diffuse everyday stuff is traumatic. And
perhaps even more important still, if you take somebody, and this I said was me when I was a younger person, who has the rage and the anger and the dissonance of experiencing it, but have no idea of its origins, of the clinician being aware of the possibility of the backstory and helping the patient or client to come to own and name their own story, so that it becomes speakable in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's what's missing in our country and probably all around the world, is that knowledge of history and what's happened, and how this colonization has created the situation that we're in right now. And also it's about kind of getting non-Indigenous people to identify the anti-Māori discourses and narratives that are present in everyday ways, and how people talk about Indigenous people and how they think about Indigenous people. And then, you know, some of our allies might be more well informed, yet the colleague sitting next to them has completely different idea. And so it's about how do we get people to address those things and have those conversations, so it's not just Indigenous or people of colour doing that work and doing all the
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're coming sadly to and Alice's question was a lovely point to wrap some of this up. And maybe what we could do before I hand back to Ludi is if the three of you, and I want to thank Celia and Jen for your participating, the audience speak, but I wonder if you have any final few words or thoughts here with our jazz that we experience. Harry, what do you think?
Yeah, so I was really struck by the idea of racialized trauma, how we can take that into account, but to recognize that it's not just an emotional space or psychic, it's actually embodied and it's relational, but also that we shouldn't think purely in terms of trauma-informed interventions, but trauma-informed services, if that's what we're providing, and they're different things, because it would mean completely restructuring the services, including ourselves in that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ria. Your thoughts?
I think it comes back to power again, and realizing right now we're still building our critical mass and we're still transforming the system. So how do we get people to think about their own positionality and how they are in relation to Indigenous people, Black people, people of colour, and how they, the importance of that, and the importance of humility really in those engagements.
Kia ora. Michael.
I had two thoughts. One, you might not all be aware of this, but there's a huge right-wing reactionary movement in the US now, which is a diversionary tactic by right-wing Republicans who really seem to have no ideas. And they're trying to pass laws, which they've already passed in Texas and are about to pass in Florida, banning what they call critical race theory, which is any awareness of slavery or white supremacy in the United States. So this is exactly the inverse of what we're speaking about, a silencing of the possibility of exploring healing. And the other thought I had was, we've never met before, and us three met here for this dialogue today, and it is just very heartening to see what human dialogue can do and how we can reach across boundaries and find areas of understanding and hope in seeing that we're all engaged in trying to understand this work together. It gives me a very positive feeling and a great sense of privilege that I was part of this group. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michael. And I, as a moderator, have been deeply touched by the richness of our conversation. It's still reverberating and resonating with me, and I'll need time to metabolize a lot of what came up here. And I want to also thank all the audience, to your questions, your listening, your wondering, and to be with us in this exploration. I also want to thank all the people who made this possible. It's a very special and privileged space to be part of. A difficult topic. deeply. So with that, I'd like to
Yes, we disappeared, Ingo, but I suppose that I can speak now. First of all, I'm very impressed.
Please.
Yeah. Okay, I'm very impressed by this webinar. I think there were a lot of topics handled in such a compact time, and it's a pity that we don't have more time to do an exploration. But it's good that we see it again. In a few weeks, it will be on the website of ISPS. So I think that's necessary. But there were so many ideas, and I am very grateful to all the panelists that you were so rich in this discussion, and also you, Ingo, who did it in a marvelous way. And I'm also grateful to Cicely and Jen, who followed the chats and followed the Q&As, because the audience was very, very active. I saw very chats, very many questions, and there were only a few questions who were brought here in the during the discussion, but there are other interesting questions also. Yes, I'm very happy with this webinar. Thanks for you all. Thanks also for Antonia and for organization of the practical things, and also for Mariana. So I can conclude that ISPS cannot remain indifferent to racism and psychosis. Today we received a lot of input, and I think that we have to continue our work on racism and psychosis. Surely we will do this. But we are also interested, which topic would you suggest to ISPS for the next webinar in the future? And I propose now to Antonia to give a final poll. Antonia, yeah. Our question is, and here again, the multiple choice, which topic would you like ISPS to consider doing another webinar on? Personal experiences of psychosis, experiences of working with people with psychosis, susceptibility, different approaches to understanding psychosis, different ways of working with people with psychosis, prejudice, discrimination, diversity, and psychosis. So you can fill it in, and then I'm curious for the results. Oh, all the topics are interesting, I think. Yes, good. But we will take it up in our EC and see what we can prepare for you. If someone of the attendees can write a review of this webinar for our next international newsletter, it will be very welcome. The person who likes to do this can send us an email before the end of August, and I think that Antonia can give in the chat the email address when you write isps@isps.org, I think, then you can write your review. Also, if you have other suggestions for a webinar, for a future webinar other than we had in the multiple choice, please mail to us. You know, these webinars are organized for free, and if you are not a member of ISPS, you can give a small donation. But you can also join ISPS as a member, and on the website of ISPS, you can find how to do this. Membership fees contribute to the ability of ISPS to offer such free webinars. Finally, I would like to invite you all to the next International ISPS webinar of September of this year that Maurizio Pechizia and his team in Perugia will prepare for us with the title Virtual Healing Spaces. I hope to see you all again there, and I wish you a good summer in the northern part of the world and a quiet winter in the south. Hope to see you again. Bye, and thank you all. Bye.